This podcast of the Pat Campbell Show is powered by the law offices of John M. Dunn.
Okay, so last week we were talking a lot about our state, Oklahoma, some of the history involved. Two stories in particular that sort of popped up on the radar. First was out of Claremore. It had to do with the Will Rogers Museum and a cornerstone that was actually from a livery. And it's not something you could see from the road. You'd have to get out of your car. You'd have to peer around a statue to see the cornerstone and then be offended, okay, by what looks, I guess to the uneducated eye, like a Nazi swastika. But it's not. There's a clue on the cornerstone. It's called 1902, because if you know your history, you know that Hitler and the Nazis had not risen to prominence in 1902. You probably know that Will Rogers was a Cherokee, and you probably know, wait, that's not a Nazi swastika, that's the whirling logs symbol that a number of the tribes use, in fact, a symbol that predates Jesus Christ. It's also a symbol that was used by the 45th in World War I, okay? But that aside, you don't let facts like that get in the way of a good rant, because Black Lives Matter, at least one guy, the Reverend, I think, Johnson, wants it removed because he's offended, okay? So we talked about that. We also talked about the state constitution. We had State Senator Nathan Dahm in studio. He has some interesting things to say about the Constitution, including that it's one of the most socialist documents ever passed in the United States. And also he talked about some of the progressive people that were involved in putting our Constitution together. In fact, a couple of lawyers that were run out of Texas came here. So we're going to talk about both of those things today with John Dwyer, Oklahoma historian. Had him on the program not long ago. He wrote the book, The Oklahomans, The Story of Oklahoma and Its People, Volume 1, Ancient to Statehood. We're also going to talk about some of the tribes that were indigenous to this region before the white man ever showed up. And what really triggered me to call John over the weekend was a caller by the name of William, who phoned into the show Friday. For those of you who missed it, here's William. Now, if I want to go to the phones here, let's take some calls. Let's start with William, who wants to weigh in on the Native Day. William, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Most of these indigenous people in Oklahoma are what they call themselves. Were brought here by the national government, by the Yankees. That's why they fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Most people who read their Oklahoma history know that. The deal about the reverse swastika, it's been around for thousands of years. Of course, it was also the symbol of the 45th Division.
But by the way, the one in Claremore is not a reverse swastika. It's the whirling logs. There's two symbols that the Indians use. And part of the reason the 45th used it was because there was a number of Native Americans in the 45th.
Yeah, but that's not what it really was. It symbolizes the giant spider that the 5 civilized tribes came over from the south of France in Europe. 10,000 years before the rest of them came.
The giant spider. You know, the same one that was in Stephen King's It. Pick it up.
Down from Mongolia. It's 50,000 years ago. 5 civilized tribes' DNA matched the Europeans, does not match the Mongolian. So you can't put all these people in one big lump. Decided they had the land for 40,000 years and did nothing with it except roam around it out.
Wow. Okay, William, I'm just going to leave that there. We'll go along to another call. Oh, seldom am I left speechless. Friday I was. It was like I had all the air knocked out of me. So, with that as some background, let's bring aboard John Dwyer. John, welcome back to the program. Good morning. How are you, sir?
Hey, I'm honored to be back with you, Pat, and I just want to shout out to your listeners that this program of yours, I hope they don't take it for granted. In this day of historical and cultural confusion in America, to have a voice of truth that's clear and reasoned like yours going out there every morning in green country, I just hope your listeners don't take it for granted. They support you in every way that they can, my friend.
What's interesting is when I called you, you told me you had just spoken at the Will Rogers Museum not long ago.
That is correct. I was up there just a couple of months ago in Claremore, and again, for the listeners, if you haven't been up there, the Will Rogers Museum in Claremore is just a tremendous outing. I could not believe all of the new and recent features they have. Beautiful paintings by Oklahoma artists like Mike Wimmer, interactive video type things where you punch a button and you get to see Will talking on a particular topic. So the Will Rogers Memorial Museum Museum in Claremore is a great outing just for an individual or a family. And, of course, the grounds around there are beautiful, great place for a picnic and that sort of thing. Make a day of it.
Yeah. I didn't want to tell the Reverend Johnson about either the Philbrook or the Gilcrease Museum, because if he were to go there, he'd find more of those Nazi swastikas. They're on Indian blankets and baskets. Some of the baskets go back to like the 1850s, and I'm pretty sure that was before Hitler ever showed up. So what do you know about the whirling logs symbol? Because you can see it throughout Oklahoma. There's a bridge up in Bartlesville that's got it. I know there's a residence if you're out Hominy Way that has it. I've seen tombstones, Native American tombstones that have it on there. I don't think they were Nazi sympathizers. So what was that all about?
Well, I tell you, in my opinion, Pat, what it was about is a day and time wherein people think that they themselves are the center of the universe, and that they look at a particular item and they make the dictate of what that is and what it represents. And this gentleman, no doubt well-intentioned, if I recall correctly, he was making the statement that, well, that looks kind of like a swastika, and that's what people think of it as today. Well, you know, as you well know, Pat, there are countless symbols and signs that have been used by many different people in many different times for many different purposes. Maybe a great analogy for your listeners to recall if they have a discussion along these lines about the swastika or symbols that look like the swastika would be the Maltese cross. That's another symbol of the German military, and they use it now, but they also used it during World War II. There were tanks and Messerschmitt fighter planes that had Maltese crosses on them along with swastikas, and yet the Maltese cross has been around probably like this swastika symbol you described since before the time of Christ. For instance, the Knights Templar, the great Christian warriors of the Middle Ages, these men went on the Crusades against the Muslims. They carried forth into battle shields that had the Maltese cross on it. So I think that, you know, if we're not careful, you know, we're going to allow anything that offends anybody to whitewash and erase our history. And, of course, you well know, I'm sure you've talked about this on your program, that it's people like Mao of Communist China, people like Stalin and Hitler himself, that are the best ones about wiping out the signs and the symbols of the past.
You know, I talked about ISIS on the program. When they go into countries like Syria, Afghanistan, the first thing they start doing is destroying historical symbols. Tear them down, you know, destroy them, because what they're trying to do is erase the history here. So let's talk about a couple of things that this William brought up. Okay, so first of all, he implies, well, he doesn't imply. He says that the various Indian tribes fought on the Confederate side. Now, I went to school back in Pennsylvania, so maybe, I don't know, maybe my version, both in high school and college, was a little skewed, but my understanding was the Native Americans fought on both sides. And with the Cherokees, I thought they started with the Union and then went to the Confederacy. And a lot of times they were used as scouts because they were expendable. In other words, you could put them out there. If you lost them, it's no big deal because, after all, they're only Indians, right? And that after the Civil War, the federal government punished those various tribes that did side with the Confederacy by making null and void any treaties they had. So you know the history behind this. What's the real deal?
Sure, Pat. Well, as you know, we've got an entire chapter in our new Oklahoma history book, The Oklahomans, entitled Uncivil War. It's a 31-page chapter, stock full of beautiful paintings, maps, photographs of the time. It describes the military campaigns, the generals, the tribes involved in the Civil War in Indian Territory. That is present-day Oklahoma. Most of it in the Green Country area, most of it in and around the Tulsa area. Now, you grew up in Pennsylvania. I grew up here in Oklahoma, and I never knew any of that growing up. So I would say that, those of you, your listeners are interested in learning more about this, we've got that big chapter in our book. You can get it at the Woodland Plaza, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and so forth, and read more about it. But to your question, it's a fascinating Oklahoma history question. And the big thing is Oklahomans were big time involved in the war between the states, in particular the tribes. And you're right, the five great Indian republics, what's traditionally been referred to as the civilized tribes, the Cherokees, Creeks, Seminoles, Choctaws, and Chickasaws, they were just neck deep in the war between the states. They were split. There were natives that fought on both sides. I think in the beginning, certainly the majority of them fought for the Confederacy, and indeed the tribes themselves all allied themselves officially with the Confederacy. Now, before someone says, oh, wow, well, was that all because of slavery? Once again, no, it wasn't. Despite PBS and other places, the war between the states was fought about a lot of different reasons, not just slavery. There were many slave owners among the tribes themselves that fought for both North and South. But the main reason, or slate of reasons, Pat, that the majority of those five Indian republics went with the Confederacy was because they knew that the federal government, and that's President Lincoln on down, prior to the breakout of war, was already making noises about clearing Indian territory of natives and making it a whites-only enclave, making it another white-dominated state. Also, the Confederacy, in a very shrewd strategy of political action, came to the tribes and promised them and began to implement for them a number of rights that the federal government had never done. Now, you say, well, what would those have been?
Right.
Well, that includes district courts for them, equal rights in litigation with white people, representation in the Confederate Congress, which many of your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with Elias Boudinot, E.C. Boudinot, who was Elias Boudinot's son. He actually was a Confederate congressman from the Cherokee tribe. So there were those and a number of other reasons that the tribes in Oklahoma, the eastern part of Oklahoma, not talking about the warrior tribes out west, but the eastern Oklahoma great Indian republics, said, wow, this is a better deal for us. In fact, one other thought, Pat, not long ago, a former chief of one of the great tribes in this area in modern day, he posed me the question. He said, I've often wondered how history might have gone different for our tribe if the South had won that war.
Again, we're talking with John J. Dwyer, author of The Oklahomans, The Story of Oklahoma and Its People. Let me ask you a serious question here. I've heard from various people over the years that when it comes to Tulsa, a lot of them grew up not really knowing about the 1921 race riots, or as they're now called, the 1921 race massacre, okay? And in other words, they were getting a very sanitized version of what really happened here, at least locally in the public schools. Has there been a similar situation when it comes to Oklahoma education with their treatment of the various Indian tribes, various Native Americans that are in the state? Are they getting the full picture? We had a great conversation Sunday off air about the Osage murders, and you were telling me that you were very interested in that too. What did you get growing up here in Oklahoma as far as the Trail of Tears, the Native Americans that were here? Was it a complete picture, or have you learned a lot more as an adult researching this?
Well, I have, Pat, and by the way, you reminded me a moment ago, you grew up in Pennsylvania, and, the gentleman I mentioned a moment ago that represented the Confederacy that engaged all these great tribes in Indian Territory to ally with the Confederates, Albert S. Pike, he was actually a Northeasterner. If I remember correctly, he was from New York originally. So the idea that it was actually in Massachusetts, I'm looking here, believe it or not. So some of the biggest, most successful generals on the South were Northeasterners who believed the Confederacy had a stronger constitutional case. So it wasn't just a geographical breakout of who went with which side. But to your question, I don't think we in Oklahoma got at least most of us. I'm going to back up half a step. I know there are Oklahoma history teachers out there that have done great work in Oklahoma, but for me, and I think probably a lot of your listeners, my Oklahoma history teacher, Pat, was one of my favorite coaches. Okay, he was a great football and basketball coach. He taught driver's ed. We loved him for that. He taught me how to parallel park. But that guy was no more interested in Oklahoma history than we were. And so I don't think that most of us, and here I am, a guy that's written 6 books, including an Oklahoma history book, and I'll just put it out there, I pretty much grew through most of my adulthood, Pat, with an ignorance of Oklahoma history. I didn't even know there were Civil War battles in modern-day Oklahoma. I didn't know that, for instance, the great Stan Wadey, the Cherokee, that was a Cherokee chief, was the only Native American who was a general on either side in the war between the states. I'd never even heard Stan Wadey's name. I didn't know that he was the last general for the Confederacy to surrender in the entire war. So I think whether you're talking the Tulsa Race War, whether you're talking the Civil War in Oklahoma, whether you're talking the fact there were many different land runs, not just one, there were many different trails of tears, not just one. Most of us, and I would say in fairness to teachers, most of us probably weren't paying attention even amongst those teachers that were trying to teach us. So that's why we wrote the Oklahomans, and that's why Bob Blackburn, head of the Oklahoma Historical Society, he had seen my book, The War Between the States, my Civil War textbook, and he said, hey, can you write one of these on Oklahoma history? We need a page-turning, storytelling book that's factual but is done in an interesting way where people want to read about their history because it is unparalleled. We have an epic history here in Oklahoma, Pat, that most of us did not have a clue of, even into adulthood.
John, part of the reason I wanted to bring you on, if you listen to William, and I've heard other people say this too, basically they're of the mindset that the only reason the Indians are here is because the feds put them here. But in your book, you talk about the fact that there were a number of tribes that were indigenous to the region. In fact, I think because of some recent artifacts that have been unearthed or uncovered, you're finding out that some of these peoples, these tribes, go back thousands of years. So who roamed before the white man showed up? Who roamed what we know as modern-day Oklahoma?
Well, that's a great question, Pat, and just again to encourage folks, if they want to know more about this, you can get our Oklahomans book at the Barnes & Noble stores there in Tulsa, Amazon, and we cover this in detail, and we for instance, we go back to the fact, and one of my students, I've taught history at Southern Nazarene University in OKC area for 12 years, and one of my students actually came up with a find of just a treasure trove of arrowheads that were very old, and that led to us taking them to the University of Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, probably the foremost group of that sort in Oklahoma, and they determined very quickly, they could tell by eyesight, that these arrowheads and these artifacts went back as far as 3,500 years.
Wow.
So what that means is, whereas previous Oklahoma history books, they might go back to the mound builders 1,500 years ago or so, we've got arrowheads just under the surface, in this case, near Atoka under a bridge, going back 3,500 years. Well, that day that I was at the OU Archaeological Department, Pat, I noticed this big mold sitting on a table. It was huge. It was some sort of a skeletal head. It turned out it was the skeletal remains of an ancient buffalo, ancient American bison. The guys there told me that ancient buffalo were about 2.5 times the size of contemporary ones.
Woo! And
they said that buffalo, which was unearthed near Fort Supply in northwest Oklahoma, traditionally a United States Army fort has been out there at Fort Supply, was between 5,000 and 10,000 years old.
Wow.
So what does this mean? Well, as you alluded, what this means is there were Indians, Native Americans, people who originated in Asia going back many thousands of years before American settlers landed here, even before the 5 great Indian republics, what we traditionally call the civilized tribes, got here. So they were Caddoans and Wichita Indians, descendants of them, and they roamed around.
John, I want to jump around on you a little here. I want to get to the state constitution. I had State Senator Nathan Dahm in studio last week, and he said something I haven't heard. Well, I haven't heard the state constitution described in this way. I know that it's the longest constitution, longest document in the country, or at least it was at one time. Like you, I haven't read the thing all the way through, but Dom presented it as the largest socialist document. And he talked about the fact that some of the people that wrote it, specifically some attorneys, were actually driven out of Texas and came here to Oklahoma. But at the time, that was the height of the progressive movement at the turn of the last century. So what do you know about our Constitution, its origins, and why it is the way it is?
Great question, and as you alluded, Pat, we discussed the Constitution in detail in our new Oklahoma history book, The Oklahomans, that you can get at the bookstores or Amazon. And I think that Nathan makes a great point. This Constitution is approximately 10 times the length, the Oklahoma Constitution, approximately 10 times the length of the United States Constitution. And it did, as you mentioned, occur within the context of the Progressive Era. That is the early 1900s, a period in which, first in Britain and then in America, the classical liberalism of the Founding Fathers, that is a different kind of liberalism from modern liberalism.
Right.
That is the original type of individual responsibility, personal freedom and responsibility, limited government, where that began to give way in a big way in both major political parties to the government saying, well, this just isn't working. We've got to step in and ensure that there is a level playing field, ensure that everyone has not just opportunities, but in many cases equal results. So what happened was Oklahoma, just through the coincidence of history, became a state right smack in the middle of the Progressive Era, 1907. So you had this thought permeating the Republican and Democratic parties alike. That's Woodrow Wilson, that's Theodore Roosevelt, that's other leaders at the time. And what they set about doing in Oklahoma was saying, wow, we've got to see to it that the individual person is in some cases defended and protected from an overweening government. Now we would say, well, that sounds good,
right?
But as you know, if you go to making a certain, too many rules, then pretty soon it's that individual person whose freedom is being endangered. Now I would add one caveat to that, and you and I have talked about this before. The particular historical context where Oklahoma was founded, there was also a populist streak through that Constitution. That's why we can't say that this is a total apples-to-apples comparison today as opposed to then, because when you look at that Constitution of Oklahoma, we would say, well, there were things we don't like about it. It had too many rules. It had too many restrictions on business. But on the other hand, we would say, well, you know what? The monopolists, the mercantilists, these government cartels, where government was in league with big business to take advantage of the middle class, of people listening to your show today. The crafters of the Oklahoma Constitution, people like Alfalfa Bill Murray, Charles Haskell, and others, they were setting out to defend the common man, much as Trump has set out to defend the average American man and woman against the overweening powers of the establishment. So it was a mixed bag, and that makes it all the more interesting a story, the Oklahoma Constitution.
As you look at the Constitution, does it seem to you, first of all, Dom's making the argument that it's antiquated, it's outdated, it needs an overhaul. In fact, they're supposed to revisit it every 20 years, but they haven't done that since 1977, okay? And but as you look at it, does it seem like in some respects, at least from a modern-day perspective, they were micromanaging every little thing that people might do? He brought up on the program when I had him on, he said the Board of Dentistry. He says, do we really need a Board of Dentistry in 2017? Did they, what days you can shop for certain items, what days you can't? Does that need, what was behind that, I guess?
Great. Well, and of course, you've probably heard the illustration of they even set the temperature that kerosene would light. Okay, now we laugh at that. We think, well, at the time there were reasons. There were people that had political, agendas, even in something like the temperature at which kerosene would light. So I would absolutely agree with Nathan. There 45,000-word Constitution. There is a myriad of things in that would have no relevance to us today. Now, be careful you don't open up Pandora's box. That's why conservatives are split on the idea of a con, because what happens if you get a worse Constitution than you started with? And I would even add to that, Pat, in this day and time of divisiveness in this state, even when you have Republicans in charge of all the major organs of government, they can't agree with one another. So if you go to a new constitutional convention, it could be a real bloodletting, and I think, I'm not saying not to do it. It might be a good idea, but need to be done very carefully.
Yeah, I share your concerns, and the same concerns I had with the Article 5. Who controls the narrative? And you know how easily public opinion can be manipulated nowadays, especially by the mainstream media. It's like you're opening that up, and once you do, you may not have control of the narrative and ultimately the outcome. So it's be careful what you wish for.
Yes, sir, and I think, that may not be great talk radio at times for you and I to say, wow, there's good reasons and bad, be careful, but I think from a wisdom standpoint, to leave a society behind for our children and grandchildren that is a good one, we need to think through these things very carefully. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a constitutional convention in Oklahoma, but it needs to be done carefully, and I would add prayerfully.
Amen. John, before I forget, too, you got a website where people can find out not only about this book, but some of the others you've written, and also get a hold of you for speaking engagements. What's the best place to go?
Yes, sir. It's johnjdwyer.com. That's John, middle initial J, Dwyer, Dwyer, johnjdwyer.com. We've got information on all of our books, including the new Oklahoma history book, the Civil War textbook, and also, as you know, you get these just continual articles, blurbs, and interesting features on Oklahoma history and the people that have made Oklahoma history that most of us didn't hear about or weren't paying attention when they talked about it in Oklahoma history class.
So a couple of weeks ago, I put up a little clip from CBS's Sunday morning program. They interviewed a guy, I think he writes for the New York Times, if I'm not mistaken, but he wrote a book on the Osage murders. And when I put this up, I had a lot of people. I remember one lady. She says, "I've been here all 53 years of my life." She said, "I've never heard this story," and it has to do with the Osage Nation, which back, I guess, in the early 1920s, they were the richest people per capita on the planet. They were sort of like the Saudis are today, and some of the things they did with their money. But more importantly, this story deals with the way they were exploited. You had a lot of white settlers coming in and marrying Osage women, not necessarily for romantic purposes, but more to get their hands on the land. And then you had a lot of these women and members of their family dying off. In fact, it got so out of control that a very young head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, this was like the first case that he actually worked on, and there were some people that were convicted of killing some of the Native Americans up there. But you drive through that part of the, I was telling you off air the other day, going to places like Hominy. There's a cemetery there where I was blown away because I'm a Catholic to find out that 95% of the Osage were Catholic, and they were very rich, affluent Catholics at the time. You see these elaborate headstones or memorials. They're very rich with native symbols as well as a lot of Catholic symbols, for example, rosaries, things of that nature, and pictures, from people, what they looked like back in, 1920s. And I think I told you about the Cathedral of the Osage, which has stained glass windows that are unlike anything else in the world because they actually had at the time live Osage Indians in them, because usually in a Catholic church, the people that you see in a picture or a stained glass window are, Jesus, his mother, Joseph, maybe Moses, but all individuals that had passed away, and they had to get special permission from the Pope to put those in the windows, and they had them custom made in the early 1900s over in Germany. But that's all this rich history, and a lot of it's dying out, and people don't know about it anymore.
Well, you brought up an incredibly compelling storyline from Oklahoma history, Pat, that I'm pretty sure none of us knew about. Even in Osage County and those environs, this was a story that was not talked about. And what to me, what that does is it illustrates another truth that has just become very clear to me as I've spent over a decade now researching Oklahoma history for this new Oklahoma history book, and that is that Oklahoma was an extremely violent place, not just in the 1800s, where we had the greatest outlaws and the greatest lawmen in American history of the Old West were right here in Oklahoma. But on into the 1900s, the first several decades, you had this Osage murder conspiracy that you were talking about. You, of course, had an out-and-out war, a shootout on the streets of Tulsa that many people were killed in. You had gangsters, and this is not just Hollywood for once, blowing this out of proportion. As I've read about the 19-teens, the 1920s and 30s, this was a more dangerous place to live in than it is now. You had kidnappings. You had gangsters, Pat, that were not afraid to go in and shoot it out with police in police stations. That would just take on law enforcement. They would try to assassinate detectives and police sergeants and deputies. And I say all of that because this is an amazing history that we didn't realize was going on. And one of the centerpieces of that, the Osage murders, we're going to cover that in detail in Volume 2 of our Oklahoma history book that I'm working on right now. But for now, people can get the book Killers of the Flower Moon. I have nothing to do with that.
Right.
That's a New York Times best-selling book. You can get it at all these same bookstores you've been talking about for our book. You can listen to it on Audible, but that's a piece of American history and Oklahoma history that if you listen to it and read it from factual sources, you can barely believe that it actually happened.
When you're doing the research, especially when it comes to the various tribes here, what's been the most shocking thing you've uncovered that you didn't know, that you hadn't learned in school?
Well, and this is along with so many things where the politically correct narrative kind of typically dumbs things down for us, and the truth is usually diametrically opposed, Pat. So I would say regarding the tribes, the most amazing thing I found, well, let me just say this. A few weeks ago, a person commented to me and said, it was so sad how badly the Comanches were treated on the Trail of Tears. I didn't say anything to them, didn't want to offend them, but, if the Comanches were anywhere near any of the Trail of Tears, they'd have been scalping or trying to scalp the Chickasaws and Cherokees and Creeks. The diverse, incredibly varied makeup of the Native American tribes in Oklahoma has been an amazement to me, and it's also proven to me that this was not a calm, peaceful, tranquil, dances with wolves paradise before the evil American settler got here. The Comanche Indians, and I grew up among Comanches in Duncan, Oklahoma. I have many good friends. I have great respect for the Lords of the Plains. But these guys, the reason that you see Cochise and Geronimo and these Apache chiefs fighting the U.S. cavalry in places like Arizona or fighting the Mexicans in these Hollywood movies, it's because the Comanches ran the Apaches out of Oklahoma. They were in the process of exterminating them. So one of the great dramas of our Oklahoma history book is this compelling narrative of tribes battling tribes. You mentioned the Osage. The Osage fought almost everybody. They had a nearly century-long war with the Cherokees right there in Green Country because guess what? When the Cherokees got here on the Trail of Tears, somebody forgot to give them the memo that the Osage tribe was already here doing business with the Shotos.
But weren't there also a lot of tribes that had sort of a peaceful coexistence as well?
There were allies, of course. You
Yeah.
take the Wichitas that got along with the Comanches, and of course the Indian republics, the tribes we've been talking about, the Cherokees and Creeks, Seminoles, Chickasaws, and Choctaws, that they were more advanced as far as American culture and education and Christian faith. So they were much more peaceable among themselves once they got here. So yeah, there were alliances, but there was great drama, great wars among these tribes before the American settler ever got here.
John, we're out of time. We'll talk again soon. One more time, plug the website.
Yes, John J. Dwyer, John Dwyer. You can get our Oklahoma history book at the Barnes & Noble stores, Book and Bible Exchange and Pryor, Amazon. And thanks for having me on, Pat.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Good to hear from you again. John J. Dwyer.